April 29th, 1975. Saigon was dying by the minute. The sky above the South Vietnamese capital glowed an unnatural orange, half sunrise, half artillery fire. Smoke drifted through the humid air in long black ribbons. The heat smelled of fuel, sweat, and panic. Somewhere beyond the river, North Vietnamese rockets traced red arcs over the horizon, their thunder rolling across a city that had already stopped believing in morning. Helicopters thundered overhead, dark silhouettes against the burning sky, their rotor blades cutting through the smoke like clock hands counting down the last hours of a 20-year war. Below them, tens of thousands of people surged toward the US Embassy compound. Soldiers without uniforms, clerks without officers, mothers holding papers and children. All of them carried the same question. Would they make it onto a helicopter before the gates closed forever? Inside the compound, Marine Corporal Gerald Berry watched the crowd press against the embassy walls. The noise was like an ocean, shouting, engines, sobbing, metal scraping against concrete. The Marines had already welded the front gates shut. The only way out now was by air. Above the embassy roof, a Bell UH-1 Huey helicopter balanced in a storm of dust, lowering its skids to the landing pad while another prepared to lift off with its load of evacuees. The two machines hovered within feet of each other, trading spaces in a choreography of survival. The operation had a name, Frequent Wind, chosen months earlier by planners who could not imagine it would come to this. It was meant to be a contingency, an evacuation plan for diplomats and key personnel should the unthinkable happen. By dawn on April 29th, the unthinkable had arrived. The signal came over Armed Forces radio at 10:51 a.m. The temperature in Saigon is 105 degrees and rising. This will be followed by Bing Crosby's White Christmas. That song, played in April, was the coded message for all remaining Americans to proceed to evacuation points immediately. Across the city, the familiar melody drifted through radios, a ghost of American normalcy in a city collapsing under its own history. Within minutes, the sound of rotor blades became constant. CH-53 Sea Stallions and CH-46 Sea Knights from Task Force 76, waiting aboard carriers in the South China Sea, began shuttling between the ships and Saigon. They followed a pattern that looked, from a distance, like an endless revolving door, helicopters landing, loading, lifting and vanishing into the grey haze toward the coast. Tan Son Nhut Air Base, once the pride of the US military effort, had already fallen into chaos. At dawn, North Vietnamese artillery shells had struck the runways, destroying aircraft and cutting off any hope of evacuation by fixed-wing transport. The control tower burned. Pilots still tried to launch what helicopters remained intact, dodging shrapnel and smoke. A Marine CH-53 took a direct hit minutes after takeoff, disintegrating in mid-air, its fall visible from the embassy rooftop. Ambassador Graham Martin, grey-haired and exhausted, moved through the embassy halls, refusing to concede defeat. He ordered the flag not to be lowered until every American had been evacuated. Outside, Vietnamese employees, translators, drivers, secretaries who had worked for the US for years, begged for entry. Some carried American identification cards, others letters of recommendation. Many carried only hope. The Marines could not let them in. By noon, the city had begun to dissolve into sound and motion. Columns of refugees clogged the roads to the port. Fires burned unchecked across neighbourhoods where fuel depots had been hit. The smell of kerosene and rice smoke hung thick over the river. The last South Vietnamese units around the presidential palace fired sporadically at targets they could no longer see. And above it all, the helicopters kept coming, green machines streaked with soot, their engines screaming as they clawed upward through the smoke. Each carried between 20 and 30 people, each flight a desperate equation of space and weight. There was no time for manifests, no time for farewells. Operation Frequent Wind had begun, a rescue mission so vast and improvised that it would move more than 7,000 people in less than 24 hours. It was not the dignified withdrawal imagined by planners in Washington, nor the orderly conclusion promised by diplomats. It was something raw, louder, and more human, a final race against history. At 3:15 p.m, a young Marine named Mike Sullivan stood on the embassy roof and counted the helicopters arriving in sequence, one every 8 minutes. He could see the city burning in every direction. From his vantage point, Saigon was not falling, it was evaporating, into smoke, into sound, into memory. By the spring of 1975, Saigon was already a city living on borrowed time. The collapse had not come suddenly, but as a slow-motion implosion, a sequence of failures too vast and too human to stop. The North Vietnamese Army had advanced in a rolling tide down Highway 13, seizing city after city with methodical precision. Pleiku, Ban Me Thuot, Da Nang, each had fallen in weeks, sometimes days, their defenders abandoning equipment worth billions in their retreat. When Da Nang fell on March 30th, the last major port outside Saigon vanished from the map. Helicopters fled south packed with soldiers, children and even livestock. Men clung to the skids as they lifted off. Pilots kicked them loose to keep from crashing. It was the moment American intelligence officers finally understood what Saigon's leaders had refused to admit. South Vietnam no longer existed as a functioning state. President Nguyen Van Thieu, once the face of America's Vietnamization strategy, resigned on April 21st. He left behind a speech filled with bitterness and accusation, claiming the United States had betrayed its promises, that Congress had cut aid, that America had abandoned its ally. His departure from the presidential palace was unceremonious. A small convoy of cars slipped through the back gate toward Tan Son Nhut, carrying with it the last pretense of civilian control. The generals who remained divided the capital into defensive zones. They drew lines on maps that no longer mattered. Ammunition was low, fuel was almost gone. The Air Force that had once been the fifth largest in the world had fewer than 30 aircraft still capable of flight. The roads around the city were choked with refugees, families carrying mattresses, cages of chickens and the remains of their homes on ox carts. Inside the US Embassy, the tone had shifted from diplomacy to triage. Marine guards built makeshift barricades in front of the compound. Helicopter landing zones were marked on the roof with fluorescent paint. Staff burned classified files around the clock in metal barrels on the lawn. The sound of shredders and paper igniting became the soundtrack of the embassy's final week. At the Defence Attaché office, just across the city, the logistics officers responsible for coordinating the evacuation stared at flight lists that grew longer by the hour. The names were mostly Vietnamese: translators, pilots, interpreters, and government workers who had supported the US mission for years. Every name was a life in danger. Every deletion from the list was a sentence. American military advisors still in country received conflicting orders. Some were told to stay in place. Others were told to stand by for extraction. Rumours spread faster than orders. Some believed they would be evacuated by fixed-wing aircraft, unaware that the airfields had already been cratered by artillery. Others believed they were forgotten entirely. At sea, Task Force 76 assembled under Vice Admiral George P. Steele, an armada of more than 40 ships, including aircraft carriers, destroyers and amphibious transports. Their decks were cleared for helicopters, their holds were cleared for refugees. Offshore, under the blazing tropical sun, crews prepared for an operation that would make Dunkirk look small by comparison. Inside Saigon, the mood turned feverish. The banks had closed. Radio stations played patriotic music and old speeches from a government that no longer functioned. At night, tracer fire arced over the river like fireworks. Black markets exploded with panic sales. Gold traded for a seat on a departing plane, dollars for a fake passport, diamonds for a promise. Ambassador Martin refused to leave. His aides urged him to evacuate early, but he stayed, insisting that his presence was essential to maintaining order. He was a man trying to hold back the tide with paperwork. Every morning he dictated cables to Washington requesting more time, more helicopters, more assurance that Saigon would not be abandoned. Each evening he walked through the embassy courtyard, avoiding the eyes of his Vietnamese staff who knew time was gone. On April 28th, as the city sweltered in unbearable humidity, the first North Vietnamese jets appeared over Saigon. They were captured. A-37 Dragonflies, American-built planes now flown by North Vietnamese pilots. They dropped bombs on Tan Son Nhut Air Base. An irony so sharp it bordered on biblical. American planes flown by America's former enemies, bombing the last American stronghold in Southeast Asia. The explosions tore through fuel tanks and barracks. The shockwaves rolled across the city, windows shattered miles away. From the embassy rooftop, Marines could see the columns of smoke rising from the airfield, the final proof that the evacuation would happen by helicopter, or not at all. The night of April 29th fell heavy and unnatural over Saigon. The kind of darkness that feels manufactured, thickened by smoke and fire. The city no longer had a rhythm, it had a pulse. From above, seen through the haze of burning oil and shattered glass, it resembled a vast circuit slowly shorting out. Electricity flickered in neighbourhoods, died in others. The hum of the city had become the thrum of rotor blades. The first Marine helicopters began landing on the embassy roof shortly after 10 p.m. The pilots were flying by instinct, navigating through smoke, traces, and the blinding flashes of artillery on the outskirts. They used no navigation lights. The enemy was close enough to see them from the ground. In the dim glow of the rooftop floodlights, the green silhouettes of CH-46 Sea Knights touched down one by one, each staying less than 3 minutes. Marines on the landing zone had stripped the process down to its mechanical minimum: land, load, lift, repeat. Each aircraft carried about 30 people, sometimes fewer when the heat and altitude robbed the engines of power. The evacuees crouched low as the rotor wash blasted them with dust and papers. The air was thick with kerosene and sweat. Many had waited hours, some days, for this moment. They were diplomats, journalists, clerks, Vietnamese staff, and children clutching the hands of strangers. For some, it was their first time on an aircraft. For others, it was the last time they would ever see their country. On the embassy roof, Lieutenant Colonel James Keane, commander of the Marine Security Guard Battalion, coordinated the evacuation with the precision of a surgeon and the detachment of a man who had run out of choices. The embassy grounds below were already packed shoulder to shoulder with thousands of South Vietnamese citizens begging to be lifted out. Marines had locked the gates hours earlier. The crowd pounded on the walls until their hands bled. From the roof, Keane could hear the muffled roar of desperation rising with the rotor wash. Inside the compound, Ambassador Martin was still at his desk. His office was lit by a single lamp, the walls bare except for a framed photograph of his son, who had died years earlier in Vietnam. Martin refused to leave until every American and as many South Vietnamese as possible were evacuated. His staff pleaded with him to board one of the early helicopters. He waved them off. He was the last man in the building who still believed the embassy could function as an embassy. Meanwhile, the evacuation at other points in the city descended into controlled chaos. At the Defence Attaché compound, helicopters lifted off from the parking lot every 7 minutes, guided by Marines with flashlights waving circles in the darkness. Some landed on apartment rooftops barely large enough for the skids to fit. At one hotel downtown, a helicopter landed on a tennis court surrounded by palm trees and telephone wires. Every pilot who landed in the city knew he might not get out again if he misjudged the wind or the power of his engines. From the decks of carriers in the South China Sea, flight controllers listened to the constant radio chatter, the strained voices of pilots, the clipped confirmations of coordinates, the static bursts of overworked transmitters. The bridge between Saigon and the fleet stretched 90 miles over the ocean and into history. Each helicopter made the round trip in about 90 minutes, refuelling on deck before returning immediately for another load. The air corridor became a conveyor belt of survival. On board the USS Midway, sailors worked in a frenzy of organisation. The flight deck glowed with floodlights, the air filled with the smell of jet fuel and sweat. As each helicopter landed, evacuees were hustled off, their faces ghostly in the deck lights, their hands covering their ears from the noise. Some wore business suits, some were barefoot. Children were wrapped in blankets, crying without tears. Crewmen marked each arrival with chalk on the deck, ship name, time, number of passengers, before pushing the helicopter aside to make room for the next. Within hours, the carrier decks became graveyards of aircraft. There was no space to store them, no time to refuel and send them back. South Vietnamese pilots, desperate to escape, flew their own Hueys and small observation helicopters out to sea, landing wherever they could. Some overshot the decks and ditched into the water. Rescue crews pulled them from the waves as the aircraft sank behind them. One pilot landed on the Midway carrying his entire family, wife, children, and even their dog, then climbed out, saluted the crew, and pushed his helicopter overboard to clear the deck for the next one. At dawn, the South China Sea was covered in metal wings. The horizon, usually soft and endless, was now jagged with silhouettes of ships, carriers, destroyers, and support vessels, their decks shimmering with movement. From above, it looked less like an evacuation and more like a second invasion. The morning sun bled through haze, turning the ocean a dull bronze. On that vast expanse of water, America's last act in Vietnam was unfolding at a scale no one had predicted. The air over the fleet roared with engines. Helicopters came in from the west in ragged lines, Bell hueys, chinooks, sea stallions, and even small observation birds barely large enough for two people. Some had been flown by Marine pilots under orders. Most were flown by South Vietnamese officers who had taken one last gamble, fleeing east until their fuel ran out, guided by instinct and desperation. On the decks of the USS Midway, USS Hancock, USS Okinawa, and other ships, chaos ruled with discipline. Deck crews guided each helicopter down using hand signals visible only in the whipping salt wind. The moment one landed, sailors swarmed forward to unload passengers, families clutching one another, soldiers still in flight suits, children wrapped in cloth. They were hustled below decks, counted, given water, and moved aside. The next helicopter was already coming in. Some pilots had no room to land. The decks were overflowing, a forest of tail rotors, spinning blades, and shouting crewmen. The only solution was brutal efficiency. As soon as passengers disembarked, the helicopters were pushed to the edge and dumped into the sea. Crewmen cut the straps, shoved the empty aircraft overboard, and watched them hit the water with a hollow crash before sinking beneath the waves. The smell of fuel and salt fused into one, an ocean burning with machinery. Captain Larry Chambers, commander of the Midway, made the hard call himself. "Push them overboard," he ordered, watching from the bridge as millions of dollars of hardware disappeared beneath the surface. There was no other way to make room. Dozens of Hueys slid into the water that day, forming a strange metallic graveyard that trailed the fleet like shadows. One helicopter, a South Vietnamese CH-47 Chinook, approached the Midway too heavily loaded to land. The twin rotors beat the air so violently that crewmen on deck were thrown to their knees. The pilot hovered over the carrier for nearly a minute, gesturing frantically through the window. Then, with terrifying control, he brought the helicopter low enough for the passengers to jump. One by one, they leapt onto the deck, women, children, soldiers, until only the pilot remained. He saluted through the cockpit window, then pulled back on the controls. The Chinook drifted away from the carrier, nose tilted toward the sky, engines screaming. Then it dropped into the ocean, exploding on impact. The deck crew stood in stunned silence for a heartbeat, then turned back to their next landing. Every ship in the task force experienced the same storm. The Hancock's flight deck was a chaos of bodies and noise. Refugees spilled into the hangars, filling every corridor. Mess halls turned into shelters. Helicopter crews collapsed where they stood, their flight suits crusted with salt. Sailors handed out rations, water, and blankets in assembly line rhythm. Someone found a Vietnamese baby alone in a crate, still breathing, still clutching a piece of paper with a name written in English. The ship's doctor carried the child to the infirmary, where sailors took turns feeding her with an eyedropper. By noon, the fleet's radios were filled with overlapping calls. More helicopters inbound, more fuel running out, more chaos over Saigon. Task Force 76 had planned to receive perhaps 1,500 evacuees by air. By midday, that number had passed 6,000, and the stream had not stopped. Far above, Marine and Navy pilots kept flying through exhaustion. They refueled, reloaded, and flew back toward a city now nearly erased by smoke. Some helicopters returned with bullet holes through their fuselages. Others came back so overloaded they could barely climb above the waves. Pilots flew until their arms shook from fatigue. The radio chatter was stripped to essentials. No emotion, just coordinates, altitude, and fuel. When the last rotor faded into the morning sky, Saigon exhaled for the final time. The air was still thick with smoke from burning fuel depots and government buildings, but the sound, that constant mechanical heartbeat of helicopters, was gone. What remained was silence, a silence so deep it felt unnatural, as if the city itself were waiting for permission to breathe again. At the US Embassy, the gates stood open. The crowd that had pressed against them through the night had broken apart. Some had fled when the Marines withdrew. Others lingered, hoping the helicopters might return. The courtyard was a wasteland of sandals, papers and suitcases split open in the rush. The flagpole stood bare. Only a few Vietnamese guards remained at their posts, still wearing uniforms of a country that no longer existed. Across the city, radios crackled with confusion. Some stations still played patriotic marches on endless loop, unaware their transmitters would soon fall silent. Others had been taken over by soldiers from the north, broadcasting orders in a calm, almost polite tone. All citizens remain indoors. The Revolutionary Army will restore order. At dawn, the tanks appeared. They came down Thong Nhat Boulevard, their engines low and deliberate, treads grinding through the wreckage of cars and telephone poles. The lead tank, a Soviet-built T-54, rolled past the zoo, past the cathedral, past the empty markets that had once been the city's heart. Behind it came trucks loaded with soldiers, young men in olive uniforms, their rifles slung casually, their faces calm. The war for them was over before they even entered the city. At 10:24 a.m, the first tank broke through the gates of the presidential palace. The heavy iron doors folded like tin. A few soldiers from the South Vietnamese Honour Guard stood at attention on the steps, not resisting, not saluting, simply frozen between worlds. The tank rumbled across the courtyard, stopped beneath the balcony, and cut its engine. For a long moment, the only sound was the cooling metal clicking in the heat. Inside, the acting president, General Duong Van Minh, waited with his cabinet. He had been in power for less than 48 hours. The air conditioning was off. The marble floor glistened with humidity. When the North Vietnamese officers entered, Minh stood and delivered the words that ended a generation of war. "I have been waiting to hand over power," he said quietly. "We are ready to surrender." The reply was simple, almost gentle. "You cannot hand over what no longer exists." Outside, soldiers climbed onto the palace roof and tore down the flag of the Republic of Vietnam. In its place, they raised the red banner of the National Liberation Front. The fabric rippled in the humid wind, catching the sun for the first time over a united city. A few blocks away, smoke still rose from the embassy compound, curling upward into a sky that had seen too much. On the streets, the transformation was immediate and surreal. Crowds emerged cautiously from doorways, carrying white flags made from bedsheets or shirts. Some cheered, others wept. Children ran behind the tanks as if following a parade. In certain neighbourhoods, old men in ARVN uniforms sat on curbs with their heads in their hands, staring at nothing. For the first time in years, there were no gunshots, no air raid sirens, no helicopters overhead. Only the hum of engines and the distant chanting of soldiers singing victory songs. At Tan Son Nhut Air Base, the runways were littered with wreckage, burned aircraft, overturned fuel trucks, the skeletal remains of hangars. In the hangar offices, half-melted telephones hung from the walls. The smell of burnt rubber and cordite still lingered. Here and there, abandoned helmets and dog tags glinted in the dust. By noon, Saigon had become Ho Chi Minh City in name and in spirit. Communist officers stood at intersections directing traffic with quiet authority. Propaganda trucks rolled through the streets, their loudspeakers announcing the end of the war and the beginning of reunification. Students gathered around them, listening with wide eyes. The people who had once whispered in fear of the northern troops now watched them distribute water and bread. There were no executions, no looting, no anarchy, only exhaustion. In the apartment buildings, those left behind listened for the sound of planes that would never come. Some burned documents and photographs, evidence of cooperation with Americans, old ID cards, uniforms. Others hid in attics and basements, convinced the soldiers would come for them. Many simply sat by their radios, waiting for instructions that would never arrive. The streets grew quieter as the heat rose. Markets reopened by evening, timidly at first, then with growing confidence. The smell of grilled food returned to the air. Life, cautious, fragmented, but undeniable, began again among the ruins. The sea became the last escape route. Within days of Saigon's fall, the harbours of Vung Tau, Can Tho, and Nha Trang filled with ships, barges, fishing junks, and anything that could float. Families poured onto piers carrying sacks of rice, photographs, and the weight of 20 years of war. The air smelled of diesel, salt, and fear. By the first week of May 1975, more than 100,000 people were at sea. Soldiers without uniforms, mothers with infants, children staring into the horizon. The great migration of the defeated had begun. The South China Sea was calm at first. Flat water stretched to infinity, broken only by oil slicks and the wakes of overloaded vessels. The sky was a grey lid pressing down on the ocean. From above, the exodus looked like a shattered fleet, trawlers and patrol boats drifting side by side, some listing dangerously under the weight of too many passengers. The ghosts of the airlift now sailed instead of flew. Among the first to flee were remnants of the South Vietnamese Navy. Admiral Chung Tan Cang, commander of the fleet, had given one last order before communications collapsed. "Take the ships and go east." Hundreds obeyed. Gunboats, corvettes and supply craft fled down the Saigon River, their decks crammed with refugees. Some carried as many as 3,000 people on ships designed for 100. The wakes behind them shimmered with debris, furniture, uniforms, and the last possessions of a fallen army. Out at sea, chaos mingled with order. US Navy vessels, still positioned offshore after Operation Frequent Wind, began receiving radio calls from the fleeing flotilla. "This is Republic of Vietnam Navy Ship 17, low on fuel, requesting permission to approach." The voices were steady but strained. American ships guided them in, one by one, their radar screens filling with blips like a storm of metal insects. By May 2nd, the exodus had become a logistical miracle improvised in real time. On the decks of the USS Kirk, a small destroyer escort, sailors worked without rest guiding South Vietnamese ships to safety. They passed out water, ration packs and fuel hoses. The Kirk's crew, barely 200 men, became the lifeline for thousands. Its captain, Commander Paul Jacobs, made a decision without waiting for Washington's approval. The refugees would not be turned away. Every ship that reached them would be refueled, resupplied and sent onward. The convoy grew until it resembled a floating city. More than 40 South Vietnamese vessels, gunboats, cargo ships, fishing trawlers, stretched across the horizon. Helicopters buzzed overhead, dropping crates of supplies. Children waved from the decks, mothers tied sheets to masts as makeshift flags. Some ships drifted dangerously close, their engines dead, crews too weak to signal. The Kirk sailors rigged tow lines and dragged them forward through the waves. But the sea was merciless. Storms formed without warning. Food ran low. Engines failed. Pirates appeared on the edges of the convoy, scavenging the desperate. On board one trawler, a woman gave birth in the dark, her cries lost to the wind. On another, a group of men buried their captain at sea, sewing his body into a blanket and lowering him into the grey water. They sang softly, their voices carried away by the tide. After several days, the American fleet turned south toward the Philippines. The refugees followed, a slow, fragile armada crawling across the ocean. Radio operators aboard the Kirk relayed coordinates to Subic Bay, where preparations were underway to receive them. Admiral Steele ordered every available ship to assist. The operation, now unofficially called Operation New Life, became one of the largest humanitarian evacuations in naval history. As the convoy neared Subic Bay, the mountains of Luzon appeared through the haze like a mirage. The sight triggered a wave of emotion across the decks, laughter, sobs, prayers. For many, it was the first time they believed they might live. The ships limped into port one by one, streaked with rust and exhaustion. When the first South Vietnamese sailors stepped onto the pier, they saluted the American officers, their uniforms filthy but their discipline intact. Over the following weeks, tens of thousands of refugees were processed and transferred to Guam, Wake Island, and eventually the United States. Camps sprang up overnight, rows of tents filled with families clutching envelopes of documents and photographs. Some had lost everything, others carried small bags of soil from their gardens in Vietnam. For those who stayed behind, the war did not end. It merely changed its shape. When the gunfire stopped, a quieter war began, one waged in memories, in silence, and in the dim corners of newly liberated homes. The victors called it reunification. The defeated called it survival. In the months following the fall of Saigon, the new government of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam set out to remake the nation, to erase 2 decades of division, and to cleanse what it called the remnants of imperialism. For millions of South Vietnamese, that meant surrendering not only their weapons, but their identities. Posters appeared on walls across the cities, printed in red ink and simple slogans. Re-education leads to freedom. Report to your local authority. The revolution forgives, but never forgets. Thousands obeyed, carrying small bundles of clothes and ration cards, believing they would be gone a few days. They did not know they were stepping into years. The re-education camps rose in the countryside, far from the cities, hidden in jungles and mountains that had seen too much blood already. They were built from bamboo and corrugated metal, part prison, part labour camp, part experiment in ideological rebirth. The guards called them Trung Kai Tao, schools of transformation. To those inside, they were simply Tri, the camps. Former officers of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam arrived first. Then came teachers, journalists, police officers, and anyone associated with the old regime. They were told to confess their crimes of thought, to write daily self-criticisms, to memorize revolutionary slogans. At night, they recited speeches about liberation while mosquitoes fed on their skin. By day, they dug canals, cleared forests, or built roads that led nowhere. Food was rice mixed with water. Letters from home arrived months late, if at all. Some never left. One former ARVN major, imprisoned in a camp near Lai Chau, later described the moment he understood what re-education meant. They said we must clean the past from our hearts, he wrote, but the past is all I had left. In the cities, Saigon became Ho Chi Minh City, a name spoken with reverence in the north and hesitation in the south. Street names changed. Statues disappeared. The embassies and foreign hotels became government offices. Loudspeakers replaced church bells. At dawn, they broadcast revolutionary songs and public announcements. At night, they spoke of national unity to a city that listened in silence. The economy collapsed under central planning. Shops emptied. Barter replaced money. Once bustling boulevards grew quiet, lined with bicycles and ration lines. The middle class, teachers, engineers, shopkeepers, melted away into poverty. The black market became the only market. Former officers sold cigarettes by the roadside. Former nurses sold soup. Former pilots fixed bicycles. Survival became the only rank left. And yet, in that silence, life persisted. Children went to school under new flags. Women planted vegetables in bomb craters. Families listened to forbidden Western music on hidden cassette players. The sound turned low, the door barred shut. At night, the city smelled of kerosene and rain. The lights went out often, leaving the streets in a darkness too familiar to feel foreign. By the early 1980s, a new phrase had entered the national vocabulary: boat people. Thousands who could not live under the new order slipped into the night toward the coast, paying smugglers to board unmarked boats. They left with no guarantee of survival, only the knowledge that to stay was another kind of death. The camps swelled with those caught trying. The cemeteries along the coasts filled with those who failed. For the victors, the decade was one of endurance. The promised unity proved harder than propaganda had predicted. The war had left the land broken, bombed fields, poisoned rivers, and entire provinces stripped of forests. Soldiers from the north, who had walked into Saigon as liberators, found themselves stationed far from home, policing a population that met them with quiet resentment. They had won the war, but inherited its ashes. By the time the echoes of April 1975 had faded, the world had already begun to reshape itself. The fall of Saigon did not end with gunfire or surrender. It lingered like the aftershock of an explosion, invisible but permanent. It lived in the photographs of helicopters lifting from rooftops, in the grainy news footage that looped endlessly on television screens, in the quiet stares of those who had left and those who could not. For America, Vietnam became both wound and mirror. The most powerful nation in history had discovered the limits of its reach. The belief that technology and force could bend history to will had drowned in the Mekong and the jungles of Khe Sanh. Generals studied new doctrines, politicians rewrote speeches, and the public learned a new vocabulary for defeat: withdrawal, containment, peace with honour. But in the quiet homes of veterans, the war continued. Some never spoke of it again. Others could not stop. For the Vietnamese who scattered across the world, the war did not end with the sound of helicopters. It followed them into the suburbs of California, the fishing docks of Louisiana, the crowded streets of Paris, and the refugee camps of Malaysia and the Philippines. They carried it in their language, in the food they cooked, in the way they looked east when the wind came off the ocean. Children grew up speaking two languages, one of their parents' loss and one of their own new beginnings. In Ho Chi Minh City, the ruins slowly turned into foundations. The sound of construction replaced the echo of artillery. The skyline began to rise again, concrete where there had been glass, glass where there had been smoke. By the 1990s, foreign investors returned. The children of revolutionaries studied computer science instead of Marxism. The same streets that once saw tanks now carried motorbikes and cell phones. The city learned to live with its ghosts. But even decades later, the past remained close enough to touch. Veterans from both sides sometimes met at reunions, their hair grey, their medals dull with age. They spoke softly, not of politics, but of survival. The jungle that had once swallowed armies was now being cleared for coffee plantations. Bomb craters had become ponds filled with fish. The land had healed faster than its people. In Washington, a generation of policymakers who had come of age watching the fall of Saigon built their careers around one unspoken vow: never again. Yet history, indifferent to promises, continued to echo. Every new conflict was measured against the shadow of Vietnam, the standard for quagmire, for hubris, for lessons learned and forgotten. For those who had lived through it, however, Vietnam was not a metaphor. It was a place, a sound, a smell, the taste of metal in the air when helicopters took off, the humidity that clung to uniforms and skin, the moment a city of millions went silent. And in that silence, something unexplainable endured, an understanding that history is not made by victory or defeat, but by the endurance of those who live through both. The American pilots who flew until their fuel tanks were dry, the South Vietnamese sailors who crossed the ocean with their families and a single hope, the northern soldiers who walked home barefoot through cities they had never seen before, the mothers who kept photographs in tin boxes, hidden from the rain. On the anniversary of the evacuation, survivors sometimes gather in Little Saigon, Houston, or Sydney. They light candles for the dead, sing old songs, and tell their children the stories the world has forgotten. And halfway across the world, in Ho Chi Minh City, the night skyline glows over the same river that once carried the last ships out to sea. The city hums with life. Its streets crowded, its noise relentless, its people young enough not to remember what it cost to be at peace. The war that began in the shadows of the Cold War ended in smoke and silence, but its legacy still drifts between continents, invisible yet unerasable. Because the fall of Saigon was not just the end of a war, it was the moment when two worlds, East and West, belief and doubt, victory and loss, collapsed into one another and kept falling. And somewhere over that city, long after the last helicopter vanished into the haze, the sound of its rotors still echoes faintly through time. A reminder, a warning, and a requiem for everything that could not be carried away,